officer's mind what their perception was. I do think that we need to Monday morning quarterback. I don't understand why we don't look at every single use of force and study it like we do with aircraft accidents. When an airplane crashes, the National Transportation Safety Board comes in and does a tremendous investigation to determine why something occurs, to make sure it never occurs again. In law enforcement, traditionally, we don't want to do that. We have, you know, an investigation by the district attorney's office or the state attorney, and they determine if there should be charges, if the officer's force was reasonable, and that's it. But I think we should go a step further as part of police reform to actually look at some of these serious uses of force and try to learn from them instead of maybe brushing them under the rug. I think that it's, you know, I was sad. I was sad after George Floyd was killed. I was sad. That shouldn't have happened to anybody. It shouldn't happen to an animal. And it was hurtful because, you know, you see the pain that everyone's going through, and it just tremendously affects, you know, the predominant number of police officers are good and they want to do good. And, you know, we have to build off of that, but, you know, it's tough sometimes. It's tough for the police officers who actually care and who are immersed in community policing and are immersed in their careers. That stuff is tough.
I agree. I think it's tough. And oftentimes I'm disgusted by what I see. And I always tell myself, like, are we still here? Are we still in a place that these things are happening? Right? You know, when is the system going to change? Right? And so oftentimes, you know, I turn to my friends, my colleagues, my family to really have these discussions around why does this continue to happen? And oftentimes the incidents, you know, are not locally, they're not, you know, regionally. And so, you know, I always go and say, why is this part of the country, these incidents always happening in this part of the country? What is the disconnect between law enforcement and the community? What is the disconnect between law enforcement and their training? Is this how law enforcement members are being trained? Because that's not how I was trained, right? So oftentimes I think about why don't we have universal training standards for law enforcement across the nation, right? Just like for doctors and train drivers and, you know, train conductors and everyone else who has universal standards in terms of training. It doesn't seem that applies in law enforcement, because I don't see how someone who was trained like me can engage in those acts in different parts of the country. So it seems to be a significant issue around the system, looking at the system, you know, holistically and saying, how do we change this overall system? And so, you know, in a way that I like to kind of talk about it is through the young people that I work with. And so oftentimes if an incident happens, I'll go and have a conversation with the young people, and we'll debrief through that. I'll understand their perspectives on it. You know, if there's a video or a news article, we'll read through it, and we'll try to process it together, because I believe in this community approach. I believe in us coming together to understand things together, not just me as law enforcement or you as the community. It's how do we come together to understand this so that we create a better system, or we understand how to work better together. But, you know, it's really hard sometimes to watch these things on the news, to read about these things and wake up and come to work. Because sometimes I'm like, I can't believe I share the same profession as these people. Like, who are these people and why are they engaging in these acts? And so I think, you know, for most of us, just like the deputy said, who really care about our jobs, really care about the community, who are in this for service, who are in this to support others, who are in this to help others, it's hard for us to watch these videos and not say that the system needs to change and we have to do better.
Thank you for your thoughtful answers. Another thing that I think is related to this is, like, when it comes with the media attention is there's this effect that's usually referred to as the Ferguson effect, as like when, you know, there's a lot of media attention, it seems like proactive policing is reduced or dropped and then crime tends to go up. I just wanted to get you guys' thoughts on how do you think the recent media attention about police violence has influenced policing in Boston?
Well, I think that we're actually very lucky in Massachusetts that we tend to be much more progressive than other places. We certainly can do better. And I'm hoping that the police reform bill that was just passed does make some positive changes to make law enforcement sort of the career that, I'm a part of to be much better. But, sometimes there's knee-jerk reactions and we overreact, and obviously rightfully so to some extent. But then also sometimes I think we can go too far. And at that point, we start to break off into groups where there's the Blue Lives Matter folks and the Black Lives Matter folks. And I don't think that's productive. I think we end up causing more harm. And I mean, all communities. I'm not just saying police or a community of color. So we have to figure out how to do things when there's outrage to bring people together and not push people away. Because I spent many, many, many days at protests this summer where I was really the enemy, and I'm not the enemy. So how do we somehow build a coalition of community members and folks that have this, deep hatred towards police officers, when there should be deep hatred towards the police officers that are doing the wrong thing, and a deep love for the police officers that are doing the right thing, and try to figure that out. And I see it on both sides, because I see coworkers or individuals that, automatically say, well, that he's just an asshole, and excuse my language, but, where that's just not the case. They're angry for a reason. Their communities are being killed and assaulted for, in some situations inappropriately. So, that's where I see the media sometimes, I think, can sort of stir the pot and then back up and want to see what happens, instead of trying to bring people together.
So I think in Boston, we do a really good job at having like coalitions with clergy and other nonprofit organizations that we work closely with, and coming together as a collaborative, as a criminal justice system, working with our different law enforcement partners. So we're actively engaging in these conversations as to how do we do better, and what's going on in the community and how do we address them. So I don't think that necessarily crime is driven, there's a less proactive policing because of what's kind of been happening across the country. I think there's that misconception that, all of a sudden crime is rising because the police officers aren't doing anything. But we have to understand, especially over the past year, we've been living a global pandemic where a lot of young people are not in school, where, if you read newspaper articles, a lot of young people are absent from school. They're not going to school, they're not attending school. And so by default, the young people who should be in school, some of them may be out, doing the wrong things, or, other things may be happening where, people are getting in trouble and things of that nature. So it looks like, the police officers aren't doing anything, but we have to realize that there's been a pandemic. And so because, a lot of our people are not in traditionally the spaces where they'd be, whether it's work or school, other things, by default, more people are out, out and about, just kind of doing their own thing, and that can cause crime to rise. And I think, from a policing standpoint too, oftentimes when these things happen, we want to come out and talk about them and have conversations about them, and in a way that's not confrontational, right? And so we have to be very cognizant of not, engaging people when they're upset, and kind of waiting for people for people to like really process things and then have a conversation. Because oftentimes when people are really upset about some of these things, it's kind of hard to have those conversations because people are very emotional. And so I think we do a really good job at just connecting when it's right, and making sure that we stay relevant in the conversation of working together, and building together here in Boston.
Thank you for sharing. Before I move on to the next question, Lisa, I see your comment in the chat. Because we're small enough, yeah, if you do have a comment, feel free to share it.
How you doing? So as somebody who's a minority female in law enforcement, I've been doing this for about almost 39 years. I just want to say that I agree with the deputy about the guardian versus warrior, but that's defined by the department that you work for. So if a department defines your success as an officer by the statistics you bring in, then you have that warrior mentality. If a department defines your success about your interaction with the community and other things that aren't necessarily defined by numbers, and you're more community police oriented, that defines your success, and those are the officers you're going to get. So the officers you get are actually shaped and defined by the leadership in that department. I also want to agree with Jeffrey that people tend to believe that all officers are alike. So much like the community, we don't like to be stereotyped either. Okay, so you can't look at all of us and say we're all the same or classify us all in the same group. So much like the community, we don't like to be they don't like to be stereotyped, neither do we. Okay, so the community has to understand that when they deal with police officers. I also want to say that in the Northeast, I think the training is much different than other parts of the country. And I do think that we are trained very well, and you're more likely to see an officer shot here before you see an unjustified shooting by an officer shooting or a suspect or a civilian. And although it's easy for people to Monday morning quarterback, okay, and I think that's what people like to do is look at the situation and analyze something that we have to make split-second decisions. And when you have to make a split-second decision, sometimes, you know, you can't get that bullet back. You can't get that. But if I feel as though my life is in jeopardy, like everybody, whether you're a suspect, whether you're a police officer, at the end of the day, we all want to go home to our families, you know? So when I'm in the moment, and there's something happening, you know, I may respond some way that you look at it Monday morning and go, you wouldn't. But if I feel as though my life is in jeopardy, I'm going to respond, because at the end of the day, I'm going home to my kids, you know? So those are just a couple of things that, you know, I just want to, you know, people to keep in mind as we go through and discuss some of this stuff that you're bringing up.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think it adds to some of the things that we've been talking about here, especially with the perspective and the fact that a lot of us do have a lot of misconceptions as well. I have a few other questions, and then we can definitely jump into you guys asking questions, because I know you guys probably have a lot. One thing I definitely wanted to talk about, and part of this is because I know our students, in reading evidence about this topic, one of the evidence cards that they do have usually refers to unions and how they usually serve as a bulwark against change. So I just wanted to get you guys' comments on, like, why do you think that the police union is frequently cited as one of the major reasons the public and politicians cannot push through significant changes in policing?
So just before I answer that, I just want to jump back, you know, to that media question. So one of the big pushes by media around the country was about chokeholds. And in Massachusetts, we haven't been taught to choke anyone for decades. I went through the police academy in '89, and that was not part of the curriculum. So in Massachusetts, that's just not taught. It's not part of our use of force. So I just wanted to make that clear. So unions. So my first almost 20 years, I was either union vice president of a patrolmen's association or union vice president of sergeants association. And now as a deputy, I'm on the other side. I'm on the management side. So I think if you just look historically at unions going back to the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, unions play a role in certain things, such as, you know, time off and holidays and that sort of thing. Where I think unions should be pulled back a little bit is punishment and terminations. So if you steal and you work in a 7-Eleven, you're fired. If you steal and you're a police officer, you get hearings, you get, you know, all different types of things where it takes weeks and months sometimes, and sometimes even years to terminate someone, when in fact, they should be just terminated because they took an oath to say, I'm not going to steal. Now, it's not always that cut and dry. Sometimes there's really intense issues that have to be negotiated and really investigated. And it's not that easy. So I get why there's some union involvement, but I think there should be times when if a police officer commits a crime, they lose their pay, they lose their benefits, and they're terminated, and we move on. We replace them with a better cop. That's probably my biggest issue with unions. And again, I've been on both sides. and I was a very big union guy. But when it came to punishment, if an officer made a mistake, I would convince them that they own the punishment, whatever it is, because they made a mistake. I would try to say, well, let's just give them a day off and move on, because I just firmly believe that the oath is important that public servants take. And we do have a higher standard to the public. I think we have to be held to higher standards. It's a requirement, it's a necessity.
So I think that police unions don't like change. And we've seen that across the country. Police unions constantly challenging reform, constantly challenging changes in the system. And in my perspective, I think that police unions should become part of the conversation of change versus always being so against it. Change is good, right? And when we talk about reform and we talk about, different things that's going on in our country, we have to understand that the conversation is going to be different than it was 50 years ago. And so the people involved, the room, really have to step away from their conventional views of how they see things and start to be a little more innovative and listen to others. And so I think where we run into issues with police unions, that police unions think they know it all. They think this is how something's going to go. This is what my bylaws say. This is what my rules say. This is what my members want. Versus saying, all right, what's going to help for the greater good today? Versus just saying, I want the system to stay the same, right? And so I think oftentimes the reason police unions, I think, fear change is because they fear a lack of support with change, and they feel that when change happens, right, everyone's going to kind of push them away, right? They're not going to be a part of the conversation, versus saying, hey, can we get a seat at the table to be a part of those conversations around change, that would be a part of those conversations around reform. And oftentimes they just push back so much, and it just looks like there's this anti-change agenda within police unions, versus them really just saying, hey, we want to be innovators with you. We want to help create the change. We want to be a part of reform, right? We want to help legislate in terms of reform. We want to work with the police agencies. We want to work with the politicians. And they just push back so much that it just, for face value, it looks like police unions are just significantly against change, significantly against reform. And so I just think they need to step up and be a part of that reform agenda versus just being so against it, right? And so oftentimes it's misinterpreting what reform is, misinterpreting what change is. It's not an attack on policing. It's not an attack on the profession. It's really saying, hey, there's been these instances of what's happened across the globe. We need to change this. And you're a law enforcement agency, and you need to play a role in that change. And I think it almost, to them, looks like you're attacking the profession and you're trying to change the profession when you're trying to help the profession.
So Jeff's 100% right. Cops hate the way things are and hate change. It's kind of funny to some extent, but it's also not funny. But he hit the nail on the head. So
contradiction, right? But this is actually my next question before I throw it to our participants here to ask their own questions. But one thing I definitely wanted to touch on was what's been happening, what I saw happening in 2020, where there was a renewed call to defund the police. I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on what do you think about that approach to reforming policing?
So I think defunding is a terrible term. And I mean that because so many people that are pro law and order, pro police even, feel that that's like, all right, we're just going to have no police. And when in fact, and I don't know if Jeff can comment on this or not, when I go or Zoom to community meetings, people want more police. They just want good police, right? They want police protection. They want to feel safe when their grandkid walks out of a store on Geneva Ave and can walk to the store and back without something happening. I actually would love to see a way for the government, whether it's the city of Boston or the state or even nationally, come up with ways to take funding. And if they have to take some from us, I'm fine with that, to deal with the mental health crisis we see every day, to deal with the opioid crisis we see every day, to deal with the homeless issues we see every day, to deal with the gun violence we see every single day. We need to look at that, because the police shouldn't be handling a lot of those calls. We give out, on the transit police, we give out between 10 and 20 Narcans a day, if not more. because there's so many people that are overdosing and close to death. And it's every single shift, every single day. And we need to look at how do we change so the police, who are really here to protect you and to investigate crimes, are not there to solve a lot of other issues where there's a lot of situations that can go south really quickly, where maybe if you had a mental health expert or someone else, they could actually respond to that. But with that said, I also think that there's just needs to be a ton of really intense, almost looking inside to see where we can do better in police reform, because there's a number of ways that I think we could do better, and we can talk about that at some point if some of the questions relate to that. But.
So I think within the law enforcement community, within police unions, within supporters, heavy supporters of law enforcement, there's a misconception that defunding the police means getting rid of the police. And defunding the police does not mean getting rid of police. People want police, right? When you talk to community members, they want police in their communities. They want to feel safe, right? Especially in the community I grew up in. People may say they don't like the police, but they want to see the police patrolling. They want to see that police cruiser up the street. Just in the event something happens, they want to feel that security is there. But they also want social services. And within our communities, what we've seen over the past several years is that law enforcement has become like a social service provider. And I oftentimes tell people that I'm not just, a police officer. I'm a social worker. I'm a guidance counselor at some times. You know what I mean? We get calls, oftentimes to go and wake up the kids to go to school, to go visit a home because a child is not listening to their parents. A child is not listening to their foster home, to go assist the Department of Children and Families with the child who doesn't want to go to their foster home. Inherently, those aren't police calls. Those are social services calls. So what happens with the defund the police movement is the movement is really just saying we need to allocate funding to social services so that police officers don't have to do that work. Because oftentimes when police officers are responding to mental health calls and things of that nature, they don't have the tools available to assist the person who's in medical need, right? I'm not a licensed clinical social worker. I don't have, advanced de-escalation skills, in certain capacities. Do I do a good job in speaking to people and getting them to calm down, de-escalate? Absolutely. But there's mental health clinicians who have that access, right? In terms of, some of the calls such as, telling the kid to wake up to go to school. Is that a policing call? No, it's not a policing call. But our police agencies have to dispatch the call. If someone calls for service, someone has to go out to give that service. The public wants that service. That parent who called wants that service. And so I think what the Defund the Police movement is really saying is we need more social services available so that when someone calls 911 and says, hey, my kid needs to wake up to go to school, that there's some sort of maybe school attendance supervisor or someone that, is connected to the police department that can be dispatched to that home. If we get a call for an 8-year-old who is acting up at home and a parent doesn't know what to do with them, that the social service clinicians can respond and assist law enforcement. Oftentimes, law enforcement needs to respond in the event someone is escalated, may have a weapon or something like that, but the movement for defund the police is really around providing social services. And I think it's a huge misconception that people think it's getting rid of law enforcement, taking police officers off of the street, significantly reducing our budget. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's, hey, we need to reappropriate some funds to make sure that we have some services in place. And oftentimes that's going to release the burden from law enforcement. So it's going to pull away from our call volume if some of that call volume is going to other entities that we work with, social service providers. But I think oftentimes it can be scary, in instances where we say we're going to have, mental health clinicians respond to, someone in crisis alone, right? And we've seen instances across the country where someone who is in crisis has hurt that mental health provider and things of that nature. So we really have to think about what that looks like in terms of, who responds and how they respond, and making sure that everyone is safe, both the person in crisis, the mental health clinician, the social service provider, the person who called 911, whether it's a parent or a relative or a group home provider. So I think that misconception of being against police because you want to quote unquote defund the police, and I agree with the deputy, it's a poor term. It should be, we got to find another way to engage in that conversation versus saying defund, because inherently when people hear defund, they think you're trying to get rid of something.
Yes. Thank you guys for your thoughtful answers. That concludes my part of asking questions. So actually already I see a hand up. So this is you guys' turn to ask your questions and things you're wondering about and also comment. Thelma, I see your hand up, so you can definitely ask away.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I do agree with the usage of the word defunding. It may not be the best, but what would be a better term to see in reorganizing of organizations and how we get and talk about how we get better results in the community, because I feel like Boston Public Schools, we just throw money at something that's not working and we're just getting the same results. So for me, I just wanted to kind of think about, well, how do you measure success? How does the police department measure success? Is it just crime went down, crime went up, people feel safe in the community? Those are the kind of questions that I have, like how is success measured in any organization? Because that would be very telling on how we approach a problem. Because I do think a lot of it, because I've sit in community meetings, a lot of community members are aligned with the police, especially the older generation. I just think there's a miseducation, and that's what I would like to see in the police department, of how, as you as a community, can help improve your community, right? So, I mean, those are kind of like ideas that I have, because I don't think families and communities know how to advocate for themselves. I think certain communities do it well. And I do think there's a lot of responsibility on the police, but they don't live in those communities, right? So that's my question. It's just like, how does the police department measure success in Boston or anywhere? And how do we
So
a way, yes, of moving forward?
So
yes.
At the Transit Police and Boston and every police agency in Massachusetts, we have to do part 1 and part 2 crimes and report that to the FBI. So from a crime perspective, that's how we measure success. But how at the Transit Police we measure success, say with youth and youth interactions. In the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, we were locking up hundreds of kids for disorderly conduct, trespassing, and they would end up getting an arrest record. And by developing a program called Stopwatch, where we actually work with our partners in the schools, juvenile probation, a whole slew of city year, a whole slew of groups, we have dropped down, I think, well, this year was a bad year, so let's look at 2019. We had something like 34 juvenile arrests, and we have 45,000 kids who ride the T every day to go to school. So that, from our perspective, was a tremendous success. Using mediation instead of arresting a kid, working with kids. Jeffrey does so much outreach with juveniles and sort of building off of that, doing community visits and home visits with clergy members to try to get to the root of why a kid is robbing somebody on a regular basis or acting out. So I think a decent police agency almost would want to hear from the communities they serve on how they think they are successful. And again, that's the whole guardian warrior thing. If it's all about numbers and arrests and citations, it's not going to be successful. But if it's about building that trust and that community engagement, I think you're going to see a police department's going to have lower numbers and more community support.
Yeah, I think, I agree with the deputy. There's certain systems, certain structures in place to kind of measure crime and measure success, reporting to the federal government. But I think here in Boston, I think we really measure success based on community interaction and community engagement. So really coming together with our partners to ask, how are we doing? What can we do better? We work really closely with our, institutions of higher learning, our medical institutions, to get feedback from them, to get feedback from, from everyone to make sure we're doing well. But I don't know from the top how they do, but I think for us, on the base, we're just really concerned with community interaction and how we do with community interaction.
you guys for answering. Any other questions? Would I see your hand up? You muted.
Yes, thank you. My question entails sort of trying to understand why, because I essentially, if I'm hearing correctly, I've heard from everyone here who's spoken so far about the focus on community interactions, community policing, sort of like a very positive uh, description of the work that police do. I guess what I'm trying to understand, because I've had my interactions with the police have not been have often been antagonistic, whether it's helping defendants who faced arrest and trying to procure evidence in their defense, even answering a simple thing like a FOIA request. There's often antagonistic, sort of like a reluctance to comply with certain requests for evidence and things of that nature. So I guess I'm here trying to understand like the schism between what I'm hearing, which sounds very positive in some ways, the focus on community policing and sort of, and at least in Massachusetts, refraining from using dangerous approaches like the chokehold and things, tactics like the chokehold and things of that nature. However, though, when in contrasting what I've heard with what my interactions have been, they're not matching up. I do wanna, I do wanna believe, and I have learned a lot from what I've heard today. It's just I'm interested. So essentially, to put it shortly, what are some of the structural factors that can explain the schism between, I know this is a very broad question, but what's going on with people's experiences in the community? As Deputy Horton was saying earlier, a lot of people are angry, and they are validated in their anger. So what causes that difference between what you as good police officers want to do versus what people in the community, the antagonism or the maltreatment, the injustice, and other sorts of wrongful practices that occur?
My perspective is this: I think that I may not be the norm. All right, so there's plenty of police officers that probably should go, and they should be replaced with other police officers that actually care about their fellow man and their community and making positive change. But I also think that we're only a small cog in the wheel of racism and systematic racism. And, I was a lead Boston alum from 2016, and it opened up my eyes to a lot of issues in Boston that I didn't really even know exist, like food deserts, like the housing gap and the price of housing, healthcare, how somebody who lives on Beacon Hill versus somebody who lives in Roxbury automatically is going to live longer simply because of their zip code. And so I think it's not a simple answer. And it's not, I think that there needs to be, I think Barack Obama, when he was president and he really looked at criminal justice reform, was really heading in the right direction. And then of course we ended up with madness. I'm hoping that President Biden and Vice President Harris will maybe look at sort of taking what they learned from that when Barack was president and building off of that, and then trying to engage healthcare systems, schools. I mean, there's so many things that impact why a person commits crime, correct? And how do we build and learn, and what can we do as a society to make those improvements? Because I think if we improve poverty, if there was no poverty in America, I don't think there'd be the level of crime that we see. I don't think that people would need to steal. I don't think people would need to rob. I don't think people would need to kill, because I think their lives would be better. But that's just not an easy answer. It's sort of multi-level, and I'm ashamed sometimes when I hear yourself talking about pushback from whether it's district attorneys or police officers that don't want to get to the best resolution for somebody's case or for a criminal matter. But I have seen firsthand when, and it's kind of a long story, so I'm not going to get into it, but where a DA wanted me to testify to something that I didn't believe happened, and I refused to. And she was pretty upset with me because they wanted to send this kid to prison for 10 years. And I didn't feel that he committed the crime that he was charged with. And so I've seen it, I've definitely experienced it. So Jeff, I don't know if you have.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I wanted to also hear the Detective Lopes talk, especially talk about the community policing part.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that obviously there's a lot of bureaucracy in place sometimes that prevent people from getting information and some of that stuff. And sometimes even for me as a police officer, I'm like, why is it so hard? But there's a lot of rules and regulations, and there's certain people that work within certain facets of the police department that are in charge of releasing data or things of like, or other things of that nature. So sometimes it's not, the frontline officer or even the supervisor that's responsible for disseminating information. And for us, if we had the ability to just print something and give it to you, we probably would, given that we had the authority to do that. But oftentimes it has to go through a legal department, has to go through this person, has to go through that person. So the bureaucracy that we have in place sometimes what makes it difficult. And so that's why I think it's important that we work together in collaboratives, create coalitions. So we have those type of discussions to say, how do we repair this? How do we repair that? How do we make this easier? And so I think in respect to that, I think, all law enforcement agencies could do better in terms of making sure that, we're having conversations around how do we make ease of communication or dissemination of information. And then, just in terms of like, the community policing, people inherently are going to be upset at law enforcement when they see things on the news, individual incidents happening in the community, and people are upset. They want to hear why this happened, why it happened. In Boston, as I said before, we do a really good job at going and having those conversations right away, reaching out to the people who are community leaders, whether it's a clergy or nonprofit provider, certain immigrant communities, there's certain nonprofits that, very reputable in those communities, going to those people and having a conversation saying, hey, how can we have conversations around this kind of stuff? So, the deputy mentioned Barack Obama. When Barack Obama was president, he credited us as the best community policing agency in the country. Because we hit things right in the head and just go have conversations. Let's do this. Let's do dialogues. We don't stay away from tough dialogue and tough conversations, because again, we have that philosophy that if we work together, we grow together and we become better together. And so, just like Thelma said, we're always in community meetings, and we work really closely with the community. The community knows who they can call, who's going to support them. They have our contact information. And so sometimes those bureaucracy elements may, push us away. People may get upset. Hey, this didn't go the way I wanted it to go. That didn't go the way that we wanted to go. But unfortunately, for us that are in the front line, oftentimes we have no control over that. And if we did, it would move a little smoother.
Thank you guys for your answer. Jane, I know you have a question, so I'll move to you.
Yeah, I guess my question is a follow-on to the discussion we've just been having. So much of what I think we've heard today is so encouraging about the great work that is being done in Boston and in the Boston community by the police force. And I'm at the same time, I think I read recently where there are something like 18,000 different police districts across the US, which probably speaks to some of the points that were made about bureaucracy and the challenges associated with applying the universal training standards and such. But I'm just curious as to whether or not you think there are opportunities to change that part of the system so that there are fewer districts and that there more of the universal training and standards and the great work that you all are doing can be applied to areas like Chicago or areas where, as Woodward said, they're not seeing it.
So because of the way the United States is made up, I'm not sure how or what that would look like. But generally speaking, when police departments around the country do something really positive, like what Boston's done for the last decade, or I don't know if you've heard of ABLE training, sort of came out of New Orleans, and Georgetown University is really on the forefront of this training. And it's about active bystandership for police officers. So when you see a police officer kneeling on somebody's neck, you actually have the power to do something. There's different types of programs around the country, and good police departments will latch onto those and either bring in training or build their own training. I think what I'd like to see from a national perspective is that those type of things are mandated around the country. And, you know, whether the federal government can do that since the states are independent, it's kind of hard, but, you know, we have the best gun laws in the country. I wish every state had our gun laws. You know, our training, I think, is much more exceptional than a lot of, you know, I know police officers around the country, and, you know, Minneapolis still had the ability in their policies and procedure to choke somebody to unconsciousness. It blew my mind when I read that use of force policy. And how that could even be possible this day and age is beyond me. So I think there is some possibilities, but you know, and I'm hopeful to see that kind of change, but it's not going to be easy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think obviously with so many different law enforcement agencies, you know, that becomes a tough dialogue because every city wants to have their own police agency, every state, every entity, every university, you know, every private business wants to have their own control over their security policies and their policing policies. And that's why we have so many different police agencies, and obviously districting through, you know, various settings. But I think, you know, what we could do better, and I personally think is universal training, universal use of force policies, really looking at agencies across the country that are doing a good job and mirroring their policies. You know, I oftentimes think people say, you know, places like Boston is best in community policing. So why don't we have people from like Chicago and other places coming here and learning from us? Why aren't we doing train the trainer, where we're going out to these different parts of the country and meeting with these law enforcement agencies and saying, this is how we do it. Bringing some of our nonprofit partners, our clergy partners, saying, hey, this is how we do it. This is how we created a collaborative, and really helping strengthen those communities and strengthen the relationships between those communities and law enforcement. And so I think we could do better at creating universal policies and then coming together to say, hey, let's go to this part of the country and assist them with repairing their image in the community, with changing their policies, with creating a community policing structure. A lot of these police agencies don't even have community policing. It doesn't even exist. And so we have to understand, you know, a place like Boston, where community policing is our mission, it's the core of what we do, you know, other police agencies should be leaning to us for help, right? And it's not, when we say us, it's not just the leadership, it's the people on the ground, the line officers who are actually doing the work, who can say, this is how I did it, this is how I got it done. And I haven't seen a lot of that. Obviously, I'm not a part of those conversations, but I think what we could do better is train others the way we've been trained. If I'm doing a good job at something and you want to learn about it, I should be able to be like, yeah, this is how I do it. But I think, you know, within law enforcement, unfortunately, everybody lives within their own silos. We don't have these universal policies, universal standards, or universal use of force policies. And that's what happens. Everyone kind of gets to create their own way of doing business.
One thing I'd like to see, if I may, I'd like to see a universal database, a national database. So when I fire a police officer here for misconduct, they can't move to Florida and get a job. They should never work in law enforcement again. And, you know, we've had officers that have been terminated, go to other places and get law enforcement jobs. And it's just, it blows my mind that departments would hire somebody who's been fired for misconduct. But that's something that I think could be easily done nationally.
Thank you for sharing that. I just want to make it just a quick attention to time, because I know this was scheduled to 10:30, but this is so fruitful. It's just like, we don't want it to end. I just wanted to make it clear, like, if you need a break, we certainly understand that. But before we head out for the 30-minute break and coming back here at 11, I just wanted to ask this final question, which is just like, and Deputy, you already started going there. Like, where do we go from here? What are some of the things that you feel like could be implemented to help with some of the issues that we identified here, but also some of the questions that were brought up here this morning?
So, hiring practices. We need to get away from civil service, take an exam, and if you score at the top, you get, you know, an interview and get hired. In Massachusetts, a lot of civil service police departments, if you're a veteran and you get a 72 on the exam, you're automatically on the top of the list. You could be a kid who grew up in Dorchester, has a PhD in criminal justice, has a law degree, scores 100, and we don't even get to interview you. So some of the hiring practices need to be changed. They're archaic. And then obviously continuous funding for training and encouraging hiring practices, people with education, and maybe not just specifically criminal justice, maybe some other avenues, because I think a degree is a degree, and you don't necessarily need to focus on that. You can build off of it. And then some of the other things that I mentioned about, the way we can fire people as well. I also think that community engagement and what they want from their police departments is really important. Thoughtful and thoughtful change is always positive, and I think we can build off of that. But we need to hear from what communities want from their police departments. We know the basics, but sometimes I think if we're not listening, then we miss the big picture.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we just have to learn by example. We need to come together to understand what everyone's individual perspectives are, what their viewpoints are. As a profession, we just have to do a better job at understanding how others perceive us and how we can fix that, right? And how we can work collaboratively. I think that, every law enforcement agency should have a strategic plan around how to fix whatever their issues are. Every individual community has individual issues, and the law enforcement communities should be coming together to figure out what those issues are, and then creating a strategic plan and making sure that they're meeting benchmarks. I think, the only way we can kind of grow, we can get out of these current challenges and issues that we have today, is by really coming together and saying, hey, have we done what we said we were going to do? Has the community done what they said they were going to do? Because that's going to allow us to move further, and that's going to allow us to kind of move together versus separate and apart. And so I think if we really come together and create strategic plans and make sure that everyone understands what the goals are, what the benchmarks are, what the timeline is, then the law enforcement community can become more embedded as a part of the general community versus being separate from the community. Because I think together we can do so much, and that together, we're better and more holistic.
Thank you for your answers. And once more, thank you for making the time and joining us this morning. I do want to respect your time. I know we mentioned we're supposed to go to 10:30. We're at 10:37. So we will be taking a break until 11, where we'll be coming back here, same room that you're in. And then this is, we've learned a lot this morning, at least I have. And we don't want to just leave it at the surface level of just like taking in information, but also giving ourselves a chance to make meaning of it, right? What does it mean? What have we heard? And what are the implications on the ground? Like things that we can do as civilians as well to push the agenda. So thank you so much, Deputy Horton, and thank you so much, Detective. We thank you for joining us this morning. And so we'll be coming back. I think, Detective, I spoke to you about whether or not you'll be staying for the second half. If you are able to, that's great. Same with you, Deputy, if you're able to join us for the second half. So the second half will be focused more on just like exploring where do we go from here, which is where we started talking about. So we do have a break until 11, but we'll be back in this room for that time.